Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Emma Shortis. I'm Senior Researcher in International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. I would like to begin, of course, by acknowledging the Eastern Maar and Wadawurrung peoples as the traditional owners and custodians of the land and sea country on which I live and work. I acknowledge their ancestors who have cared for the lands, the rivers, and the sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations now. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and we acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded. Welcome, everybody, to this webinar on the latest developments in the US presidential elections. Just a heads up that you can register for future webinars at australiainstitute.org.au/webinars. Before we get stuck in, just for those of you who might not have joined a webinar before or need a refresher, a couple of quick Zoom tips. Towards the end of our discussion today, we'll go to your questions, to questions from the audience, and you can type those into the little Q&A box down the bottom of your screen at any time. And you can also upvote other people's questions too if you think there's a really good one in there. Please do keep things civil and on topic in the chat or you'll get booted out. And finally, this is a live event. It is being recorded and the video will be available shortly on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. Okay, to get stuck in, it's been another big week in what's been really a big few months in American politics. Of course, we had the first debate yesterday between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. We've had some new details about policy platforms. We've spent far too much time talking about pets. We even had a Taylor Swift endorsement come through late yesterday. And to discuss all of this and what it might mean for the rest of us, I'm so pleased to welcome our guest for today's webinar, Nick Bryant. Nick, as many of you will know, is a former BBC correspondent where he covered Washington, New York, South Asia, and Australia. He's in fact a historian by training and the author of several books, including one that made its way into the Oval Office, which not many people managed to do. His latest book is called The Forever War, America's Unending War with Itself, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Emma, it is fantastic. I'm watching that number of people tuning in and I'm just blown away by it. There are so many people who are fixated, I think, like us with this race and just want to keep talking about it and want to keep hearing about it. But it's great to have so many people join us for this discussion.
It sure is. And I think you're right. It's such a reflection of, I think, the interest, the global interest in this election campaign, because instinctively, I think people know, how much of an impact it can have, not just on Australia, but on the rest of the world. I guess, Nick, we can't really get away from immediate events. And of course, we had that debate yesterday. You've been watching and writing about American politics and election campaigns for a long time. So why don't we start with, your take on the debate yesterday? What did you think of it?
Oh, Emma, ever since Donald Trump came down that golden escalator in 2015, I've been watching him in debates. I've watched every single minute of every single debate that he's ever taken part in, from those early exchanges with low energy Jeb Bush and little Marco Rubio and lying Ted Cruz to the kind of presidential showdowns with Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. And frankly, I thought that Kamala Harris handled him better yesterday than any other candidate who has appeared on stage with him. I mean, she executed the game plan perfectly. At times, you could literally see her digging the elephant traps in the preamble to the points that she was making. But Trump, like this sort of lumbering giant, just kept on falling into them, didn't he? And they must have been absolutely delighted by that. Look, I don't think it was a flawless performance by any means. I think on the early question about the economy, I think, her team probably wouldn't have thought she got her message across quite as effectively as they would have hoped. But I thought from that second topic onwards, and the second topic, of course, was abortion, I just thought she really hit her stride. I thought Trump started making mistakes at that point. He spoke, for instance, about the genius of the Supreme Court justices, the 6 Supreme Court justices who had overturned Roe versus Wade. And I think that's the sort of clip that will come back to haunt you. And I think there were many clips from that campaign that will come back to haunt you. But of course, you know, debates are a Rorschach test, aren't they? You look at them and you see different things. And in a very divided America, a chronically divided America, you know, people will have different takeaways depending on, you know, whether they like Kamala Harris or they hate the prospect of her.
Yeah, of course. You know, it was a kind of split screen of the two versions of America that, you know, as you've written about, have kind of always been at war with each other, which hopefully is something we'll get into. But I just wanted to pick up on one of your observations there, because you mentioned the clips that will come out of the debate and how important they were. And it seemed to me that much of Harris's performance, especially her physical performance, you know, the way that she used her face and her facial expressions to respond to Donald Trump, were kind of ready-made for social media. You know, it was quite a masterful performance in that sense. And, you know, when a debate goes for 90 minutes and people are kind of tuning in and tuning out, and, you know, some people aren't watching at all, those clips become increasingly important. And it seems like Kamala Harris, especially, you know, that her campaign is oriented very much towards social media, often at the expense of the mainstream media. So I wonder what your take is on the role of social media, not just in the debate, but in the campaign, and how the two candidates are using it quite differently.
Yeah, look, I think you're absolutely right to say that not everybody watches 90 minutes of a debate. And even if you do, the on the night winner can often not look so good in the days afterwards when, you know, maybe something they've said is factually wrong. I mean, that's not such an issue in the Trump era, obviously. I always remember the debate between Al Gore and George W. Bush in 2000. It was only afterwards that we noticed that Al Gore had sort of harumphed and tutted and sighed his way through it. And that became the meme at a time when we were kind of starting to see the emergence of memes in an increasingly online polity. And yeah, often you don't really know the true winner until a couple of days later. Those clips have been played ad nauseum. Now, you know, frankly, Trump had some decent clips. I mean, strangely, I thought his closing statement was effective. You know, on the economy, if you have all these plans, why haven't you done them? You've been in power 3.5 years. I thought that was pretty effective. Presumably, that kind of clip will get replayed, especially on sort of sympathetic outlets like Fox News. But yeah, I mean, I think Kamala Harris clearly won the kind of meme war in the debate. And you make an interesting point about those facial expressions. I mean, that was one of the things that really hammered Joe Biden, wasn't it, in that first presidential debate? It wasn't only what he was saying, which was, you know, incomprehensible at times. It was also his look when Trump was speaking. They had it in split screen, obviously, and he did look sort of dazed. He did look confused. He did look like a guy who had done his dash. And they always say you should watch the debate with the volume down to find out who's the winner. I always thought, you know, I haven't got time to watch it as well with the volume down, but you do see those pictures emerged, and the pictures, I think, do convey the sense that this was a command performance from Kamala Harris. But as I said, I mean, some people have watched that command performance and hate the very notion of it, hate the very notion that a black woman was bossing a former president, Donald Trump.
Yeah, look, I think that's such an important point, and I think you could almost see at times Trump's struggle to take her seriously in that sense, and struggle to know how to respond to her, kind of given that context. And I think that leads to one of the very specific moments in the debate where Harris was asked about Trump's comments about her race, and particularly questioning whether she was black, and that Harris's response to that was particularly interesting, because she seemed to continue that theme of not focusing on herself as an individual, but focusing, you know, flipping the focus back onto Trump and to the bigger racial context of what was going on there. So have you observed a change there as well in the conversation and the way people are responding to Trump's pretty bold and unvarnished racism? You know, he doesn't hide it.
Yeah, up until now, Kamala Harris has kind of downplayed her race, hasn't she? She's tried to downplay her identity. She's tried to downplay her agenda. She's not making a big point about the historic nature of her candidacy. And Barack Obama did this in 2008 as well. I think it's often forgotten. People think about the race speech that he famously delivered. Do you remember when Jeremiah Wright, the pastor's sermons, came to light? But if you read the race speech, it was as much about the white side of his family as it was about the black side of his family. He was trying to sort of bring those two strands together, and he constantly de-emphasized race throughout his campaign. He left it to others really to talk that up. He didn't project himself as the extension of the civil rights movement, as Jesse Jackson had done when he ran in the 1980s. He didn't see himself as the sort of the torchbearer of the struggle for black equality. Kamala Harris is doing something similar this time round. It makes sense to do that. So I was interested that she did go into prosecutorial mode on the race question, and she detailed, didn't she, the long history of Donald Trump's racism, going back to the investigations into how, as a landlord, he was discriminated against African Americans. The famous advertisement that he put in the New York Times about the Central Park Five, his leadership of the birther movement, which obviously denied the very legitimacy of Barack Obama's presidency. And I thought that was interesting. I guess the Democrats are seeing the polling, which shows that young African-American men in particular are sort of drifting away from the party. They have always been such a traditional sort of bedrock of support for the Democrats since the days of FDR. And there are risks inherent, as you know, Emma, in raising the race issue, because that issue traditionally, since the civil rights era, has favored the Republicans. Nixon in '68 pursued what was called the Southern strategy, exploiting white fears about black advance. The Southern strategy came to be nationalized over the years. Reagan used it in 1980. George Herbert Walker Bush used it in 1988 with the Willie Horton Act. You know, the Southern strategy came to be nationalized, and then it came to be Trumpified. So there is a danger of raising race, because between 1968, as you know, and 1992, the Republicans had a virtual lock on the White House. And race, playing the race card, often from the bottom of the card, was one of the reasons for that.
Yeah, I think that's, of course, I agree with you. And it has been, I don't think interesting is the right word, but to watch Trump kind of toy with the idea of trying to appeal to black voters, and particularly young black men, as you say, and then kind of be dragged back to his kind of, I suppose, original position. And I think, I mean, I'm not sure about you, but it seemed to be fairly clear from Trump's performance in the debate that he was speaking almost exclusively to his base. You know, he's rarely trying to appeal outside of that base. And I think you could even see that in the language that he was using. You know, some of his responses were really coded into the right-wing universe, into kind of Fox News language, that if you're not engaged in that space, you actually don't even necessarily have a handle on, you know, which to grab in order to understand what's happening. So do you think that Trump is doubling down on that appeal to particularly a base of young white men? Is that the way, do you think the strategy is kind of unfolding in response to Harris?
Well, ever since he selected J.D. Vance, it seemed to suggest that he was going mega MAGA. You know, J.D. Vance obviously has become very Trumpian after being a fierce Trump critic. He became a Trump impersonator. And I think now it almost seems like he has the zealotry of a convert when it comes to Trumpism. I mean, the thinking was he'd also help Trump in the Rust Belt. He doesn't come from Michigan or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, those three crucial Rust Belt states, but he does come from Ohio. And the makeup of that state is obviously similar, and the politics of that state is very similar. Ohio used to be a toss-up state, but it's become reliably Republican in recent times, although it has got one Democratic senator who's seeking re-election this year, Sherrod Brown. So they've gone mega MAGA. I think it would have made far more sense for Trump to appoint a woman. I mean, if they could have got Nikki Haley on the ticket, I think that would have been very strong. But there are various reasons why Trump wouldn't have wanted to do that, not least that she went up against him in the Republican primary campaign and said some pretty strong things against him, which would have doubtlessly be replayed. But their tactic does seem to be sort of base maximization at the moment, and maybe that'll work. But there is this theory as well that they need to reach out to some of those sort of wavering Republicans who were Nikki Haley voters, who didn't like Trump last time round and voted for Joe Biden or didn't vote at all. And as we know, Emma, I mean, you know, the male vote's a big thing, obviously, but more women vote than men. And often it is suburban women in those suburbs around cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh who tend to decide presidential elections. And given the importance of Pennsylvania this year, that could be even more important. So their strategy at the moment doesn't seem to be targeting them.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, obviously. And Nick, I'm sorry, but I can't resist when you mentioned women voters, in particular, asking you about the Taylor Swift endorsement and whether, you know, I, of course, was doing a lot of media around the debate yesterday as well, and just kept getting the question of, you know, whether an endorsement from Taylor Swift even matters. Do we overstate the influence of celebrity on political outcomes in the United States? So I wonder what your take on the Swift endorsement is and whether it matters.
Well, look, a conventional wisdom has been emerging in recent sort of elections that any kind of endorsement doesn't really matter, whether it's a newspaper, whether it was a sort of politician, or whether it's a celebrity. And there was a thought that in 2016, actually, the kind of celebrities that came out in the final days, especially for Hillary Clinton, and she was holding these events in Philadelphia, I think, with Lady Gaga and, you know, Bruce Springsteen and all these kind of things. And there was this sense that hurt her because it reinforced this sense of the kind of bi-coastal elites sort of gathering around her candidacy, and that she was this kind of establishment candidate that was, you know, despised in many places around the country. But I think Taylor Swift's a different kettle of fish altogether, to be honest. I really do. You know, the Swift endorsement is what Joe Biden would call a big effing deal. You know, it really is. And it's not just sort of mobilizing young women who Democratic insiders tell me are already sort of registering in huge numbers because of Roe, because of their fear about the threat that the Republicans pose to reproductive rights. But, you know, it's not just them, it's their mums as well. I mean, it's the mums that go along to Taylor Swift rallies as well. I was always struck covering Trump in 2016 that it wasn't just, you know, the MAGA diehards with their red caps and their faded jeans and their baggy t-shirts with, you know, Trump as the Terminator on it and all that kind of stuff. Trump dressed as Rambo. It was a lot of these mums who would take their daughters along, and often they were dressed in sort of Lululemon leggings. Often they were carrying their Starbucks, you know, and they were these prosperous mums. And a lot of those prosperous mums are Swifties. I think this is a really significant moment. Obviously, the Democrats are desperate for Taylor Swift to come out, and I think it is a biggie. And I just think the timing was kind of interesting. I mean, if you're a Democratic strategist, you probably wouldn't have wanted to come out immediately after the debate. I mean, you know, in a perfect campaign, you would want that maybe a few days later when, you know, she was getting good headlines last night anyway, so they didn't really need any more. But yeah, that's a really useful endorsement.
It is. I think you're right. And I think the timing of it was partly, this is me speculating, but Swift making sure that it didn't appear that she was working in concert with the Democrats, you know, that she was doing it independently. And I think she was, you know, because evidently it sort of took the Harris campaign by surprise.
Yeah.
And
I think you could argue that flat around, because it did give an authenticity, didn't it, to the endorsement? It did make it feel like, yeah, she's done it. She's persuaded me. I'm all in. And that kind of, it felt kind of more spontaneous, didn't it? And yeah, maybe there's a kind of value in that.
Yeah, I wonder, and I think it will be really interesting to see if it does have an impact on registration, which, as you say, is already in amongst young women is already really high. And I've actually seen one study that suggests amongst young Black women in particular that voter registration is up. It's something like 175% on 2020. Which, you know, gives you an idea of the kind of mobilization that we're talking about.
Amazing. And that's always been the most loyal Democratic constituency, African-American women, hasn't it? And and I mean, it's worth, you know, Hillary Clinton had a problem in getting white women to vote for her. I mean, that was She was obviously confronted with a massive amount of misogyny. But one of the problems that Hillary Clinton also had was persuading women to vote for her, white women especially. I mean, I often think that Hillary Clinton lost the 2016 election in 1992 when she had to introduce herself to the American people in the most appalling of circumstances. You remember that famous interview pre-Super Bowl, 60 Minutes. Bill Clinton's facing these barrage about allegations about his serial infidelity. They do this interview together. She says, you know, I'm not just some Tammy Wynette standing by my man. Well, she really annoyed a lot of working class white women then. You remember Tammy Wynette came out immediately and sort of said, you know, slammed Hillary Clinton. And a lot of people just never forgot that. And even after Access Hollywood, if you look at the kind of percentages that she was getting amongst women, white women with college degrees, it was still really surprisingly low. She only just beat Trump in that demographic. And after Access Hollywood, you'd have thought, well, maybe that would be 75, 80%. It wasn't. It was just extraordinary. So there is that. So there is that kind of issue for Kamala Harris as well. So again, I think that really, you know, the Taylor Swift endorsement really helps on that front.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, Nick, what you've just kind of outlined as well about Hillary Clinton's campaign kind of highlights one of the questions that has been looming over Harris's candidacy, which is one, I'm sure you get this all the time as well. I get it all the time. And the question is America ready for a Black woman president? And, you know, often people will go back to Clinton and say, you know, that's proof surely that America wasn't ready for a woman president. But of course, you know, I don't think we can say that because of everything you've just outlined, you know, particularly because of the political baggage going back at least to 1992 that Hillary Clinton brought with her. And I think the way that you've outlined the kind of the way race and gender plays into that kind of highlights how difficult that question is to even begin to answer.
Well, just on the
when you get it, how do you answer it?
Just on the Hillary Clinton question, I think it's really interesting. Bill Clinton was a huge problem for Hillary Clinton in 2016. I mean, the economic decisions that Bill Clinton had made as president, you know, especially the deregulation of Wall Street, directly contributed to the subprime crisis and the Great Recession of 2008. So when Donald Trump said the American dream is dead, in the aftermath of that recession, a lot of people believed them. And in many ways, that was a kind of Bill Clinton recession. So that's one point. A lot of African Americans could not vote for Hillary Clinton because they'd been incarcerated. You know, Clinton's crime bill very much directed against African Americans to a certain extent. That was problem two. When Access Hollywood came out, Trump came out and said, you know what, I've heard Bill Clinton say worse things on the golf course. Now, I've got no idea whether that's true or not, but it's plausible. And when Hillary Clinton faced Trump in the debate, do you remember the Trump campaign organized for a lot of the women who'd accused Bill Clinton of sexual assault and rape in one instance? They were there on the front row. And that always made Access Hollywood for the Clinton campaign tougher to deal with. I also think that, you know, Clinton's presidency was so scandal prone that it kind of raised the bar about what would disqualify people to run for the presidency. And I think scandal became normalized. I think Clinton did something else as well, which was to reframe the question at the heart of scandal. It wasn't who do you believe, it's whose side are you on. They did that during the Lewinsky scandal, which we should have called the Clinton scandal. And Trump did that again in Access Hollywood. He said, do you really want my Democratic tormentors to win over this? And that was a rallying moment for the Republican Party at a time when some people like Mike Pence were thinking of dropping off the ticket. So there's all sorts of reasons why Bill Clinton hurt her in 2016. Clinton also emphasized the gender aspect more, the historical first nature of a candidacy. You know, some people think that was a mistake. And there was another thing as well about Hillary in 2016 that was tricky, and it escapes me now. But I think the Clinton factor was so key. Oh, no, it's the big one. Sorry, it's the big one. She won 3 million more votes. I mean, she won the national vote by 3 million. Yep. Ordinarily, that would translate into an electoral college victory. In 2016, it didn't, of course, and that was a bit of a surprise. So that, to me, proves that America's ready for a female president. No question. And if you look at the states, Emma, as you know, I mean, most, the vast majority of states now have had female governors. I mean, there is a problem state, I think, which is Pennsylvania. Going back to Pennsylvania, it's never had a female governor.
Mm.
It's never had a female senator. And in its congressional delegation between 2015 and 2019, which was 20 strong, there wasn't a single woman. Now, I don't know whether Pennsylvania is unusually misogynistic, but if I was the Harris campaign, that was slightly worrying me.
Yeah, it would. And I mean, I think you raised such an important point, Nick, about the the popular vote, because we're facing down the same kind of situation again, where Harris may, the last calculation I saw, win the popular vote by a significantly bigger margin than Hillary Clinton did, or even Joe Biden did in a victory. But it might end up being a state like Pennsylvania and all the baggage that comes with that, and a few thousand people potentially in Pennsylvania that makes the decision. So we have this arguably broken electoral system that Americans are dealing with. And in the debate, to go back to the debate, there was actually quite a bit of conversation about the state of American democracy, and the potential threat that Trump and Trumpism poses to American democracy, in the way that it might kind of use that system against itself. And of course, you've written about this extensively, and January 6th and the ongoing threats to American democracy. So what did you make of that particular section of the debate? Because even in a 90-minute long debate, that section went for quite a long time, actually. They spent quite a bit of time talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, that was interesting as well, wasn't it? Because in the way that she's avoided race and gender so far, or downplayed those, she's also downplayed January the
Mm.
6th. It's a point of
Yeah.
differentiation, isn't it, between her campaign and Joe Biden's campaign. Joe Biden really made the defense of the democracy central to his appeal. I mean, he literally kicked off campaign year at Valley Forge, which was where George Washington's army sort of regrouped after some initial setbacks in the Revolutionary War. He keeps on going to these historical settings. You remember at the beginning of 2022, the midterms year, he delivered that speech in front of Independence Hall that was kind of bathed in this sort of blood red floodlighting, wasn't it? It looked like a Halloween House of Horrors almost. But yeah, I mean, those historical settings were always about making this historical point that, democracy was on the ballot. And Kamala Harris has not made that point anywhere near as strongly. She's tried to get onto the economic stuff. She's tried to sort of say, I'm a different candidate. She's tried to say, I'm the candidate about the future. It's time to sort of turn the page on the past, all that kind of stuff. So, it was interesting how she raised January the 6th. And it was kind of interesting how a kind of former prosecutor raised it in a kind of law and order manner, didn't it? The attacks on police officers and the attack on law and order, trying to sort of take that away from the Republicans, which has been a traditional issue for them. So I thought that was quite clever how she kind of mounted a kind of two-prong attack on Trump for that. And of course, he went for it again. He kind of started defending, didn't he? These insurrectionists who many people regard as J6 martyrs, as they're now called. And Ashley Babbitt, he mentioned this Trump protester who was killed that day, who's almost been elevated. Well, she has been elevated in the MAGA world to martyr status. So yeah, again, I mean, she'd have been pretty happy with how he responded to all that, I would have thought.
Yeah, I think so. I think she would have been happy with a number of his responses,
Yeah.
and inability to not take the bait. I mentioned at the start, Nick, that we talk a bit about what this means for the rest of the world. And you've actually, if we stay on the theme of American democracy and the role it plays in the world, you've actually just written quite a long essay about Australian democracy, and kind of outlined the ways in which Australian democracy is quite different, of course, to American democracy, but also how it isn't immune from the same kinds of forces that are undermining the integrity of American democratic systems, and trust, importantly, the trust in those systems. So I wonder, are you worried about the impact that the kind of what looks to be the slow disintegration of American democracy might have here in Australia?
Yeah, look, I've been worried about the Trump effect ever since I came back to Australia, which was 3 years ago. It was in the middle of COVID. I was in a COVID quarantine hotel in the middle of Sydney for 2 weeks. And on the first Saturday morning, Emma, I heard this roar from down below, the kind of muted roar of a crowd. And it was an anti-lockdown protest. And later on in the news, I turned on and they were carrying some of them Trump flags. Oh, this is interesting. This is kind of what I tried to escape from in leaving America. And here it is in Australia. And you remember that this became a real cause célèbre, didn't it, for the American right? You had people like Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, literally suggesting that America should sever diplomatic ties with Australia because of the severity of the lockdowns. You had, there's a famous sort of talk show host on American TV who suggested that America could actually invade Australia to liberate it. You know, you had Tucker Carlson saying things like it's a shame that the gun laws came into play after Port Arthur because Australians don't have the arms to sort of withstand the tyranny of their own government. I mean, all this kind of crazy stuff. And then Donald Trump Jr. weighed in with his tweet saying, "Don't Australia my America." And I remember thinking, well, don't America my Australia. And I was kind of worried after that, you know, you did see some, I think it's become a bit of a cliche now, and I think the term is overused, but I do think there were signs of Trumpification. I mean, you know, I think you look at Scott Morrison's power grab, you know, that secret ministerial power grab that sort of defied the Westminster tradition. That seemed to me to sort of be a violation of a democratic norm, for instance. You had in the voice referendum, Peter Dutton questioning the integrity of the vote, and by implication questioning the integrity of the Australian Electoral Commission. Now, that is the gold standard internationally of electoral commissions. And thank God Australia has it. America has nothing like that, as you know. The rules of elections are decided by the states and the counties, and there's no uniform system of voting. In some places it's on computer, in other words, in other places you pull levers, in other places you sort of put a cross in a box. There's no kind of uniform suffrage. And these mechanisms are very handy. And another great safeguard of Australian democracy, of course, is compulsory voting. Now, I've done a complete 180 on this. I used to think that Australian compulsory voting was a little bit like rear to curb parking and all these other rules and regulations that you have. It seems a little bit overbearing, and people seem to be quite meek in their acquiescence of these rules. But, you know, it really is a useful safeguard against polarization. It means that elections are generally fought in the middle rather than the extremes. And election days themselves become these kind of civic celebrations in some ways. You know, may the democracy sausage forever sizzle. Maybe, and let's hope it remains as nourishing and succulent as ever. But yeah, you've got a good system here. And you know, just to sort of say one final thing, I don't think Australians realise this necessarily, because I think there's a lot of lucky country thinking still. You know, Donald Horne's book is 60 years old in December, and I think it still dominates thinking here. I mean, Horne's critique was not only that Australia had second-rate politicians; it had a second-rate system. Sorry, it had a second-hand system. It was too borrowed from the Brits, especially. I mean, look at Parliament. I mean, it looks like Westminster, right? You even have Hansard. You even have the green and red leather benches or whatever. And the nomenclature came from America, the Senate and the House of Representatives. So there's and Horne basically, I had this idea that, you know, basically Australia was this derivative country that couldn't come up with a system of its own, but it did. And it did very early on with compulsory voting, with preferential voting. Australia was the first country in the world where women could stand for parliament. You know, there is this democratic tradition. It's not a good tradition in terms of its treatment of Indigenous Australians. That is a terrible sort of blight. But there has been a tradition of democratic innovation, and Australia has benefited from that, and it does to this day.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And a colleague of mine who's an expert in comparative democracies has described Australia's democracy as truly exceptional in the world. I think, which is a kind of nice
yeah, if you're looking for
claiming of
Australian
American
exceptionalism, I mean, Australian democracy is a good place to start. Yeah.
It is, and I think we underestimate that, you know, the positive impact that we can have on the world with that model. You know, more often than not, we see kind of what happens in America in particular as something that just kind of affects us, that we have no influence or agency over. Which is partly, of course, because, you know, the United States is the most powerful and influential country in the world, which brings me probably to what might be my last question before we go to questions from the audience. Because there was actually, the Harris campaign before this debate kind of said they wanted it to be about policy. They didn't want it to be about the kind of personality politics that we've become so accustomed to. And kind of, I'm not sure about you, but I was kind of surprised with how much policy discussion there actually was in this debate. And one of the areas that they focused on quite a bit was, of course, national security. And you mentioned in one of your earlier responses how differently Harris is speaking about law and order and the military in particular. So I wonder, did we get more of an indication of how a potential Harris administration would treat national security and what that might mean for the rest of the world, what it might mean for the role America plays in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Harris isn't the Cold War warrior that Joe Biden is. I don't think there is
Mm.
that kind of doctrinal belief in the alliance system, the post-war alliance system that has been the bedrock really of American preeminence since World War II. But I mean, clearly she believes in it very strongly, believes in going up against tyranny, believes in going up against totalitarianism. I mean, that was one of the key lines of difference that she was trying to draw, wasn't it? With Trump going weak at the knees for these strongmen like Putin and Xi Jinping, and
Mm.
Kamala Harris speaking, very traditional sort of democratic sense, what pre-Trump would have been a pretty traditional Republican sense as well. Sounding pretty
Yeah.
hawkish on that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean that obviously is a clear difference. I mean, Trump on Ukraine obviously not saying what the war that he's promising to end in 24 hours, how that war would come to an end. I mean, presumably with major territorial concessions to Russia, or possibly even a green light for him to advance on Kyiv. I mean, who knows? I mean, JD Vance as well has doubled down on I don't care about Ukraine. So yeah, there's a stark difference on foreign policy, and in broad terms, Kamala Harris represents a kind of internationalist tradition, and Donald Trump represents what's also been there in American history, which is an isolationist strand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. We've talked about this a little bit before because I'm not sure if Trump is isolationist. There's this sense that he would kind of withdraw especially, you mentioned Ukraine, but he also has this kind of belligerent approach to international relations that would involve kind of stomping all over um, alliances, which I think is not necessarily isolationism so much as just a different way and a more aggressive way of exercising American power. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, yeah, I do think the American First does sort of tap into a kind of isolationist. Trump makes great virtue of the fact that he didn't start any new wars, for instance, and he's
Mm.
tried to withdraw American forces. When it comes to foreign policy, I mean, he's so hard to predict. I mean, I heard Trump must have been about 5 or 6 years ago to this day, or 7 years ago at the United Nations. It's Hunger Week soon, isn't it? And he threatened to basically wipe North Korea off the map. Now, I was with him on the Korean Peninsula a couple of years later, and he's having this kind of bromance with Kim Jong-un in the DMZ, and he's stepping foot into North Korea. So, Trump's hard to sort of predict on the international front. I mean, he literally sort of ordered strikes against Iran, didn't he? And then called them back. So it's it's really difficult to predict what, in foreign policy terms, a Trump second term would look like.
Yeah, it's not the only difficult thing to predict about Trump. That actually brings me. I've just been scrolling through some of the questions that we've got in the chat, so I might turn to them now. Partially because there is one that I think is a nice follow up to what you were just mentioning, which brings up the Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, which of course Trump has kind of dragged back into the news cycle through what would we call it? An incident at Arlington National Cemetery where the Trump campaign staff allegedly had a kind of altercation with a staff member at the cemetery because Arlington is hallowed ground for Americans. There's not supposed to be any kind of political material or campaign material produced there. And the allegation was that Trump was doing that. And he has tried to kind of pin Biden down with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I mean, I'm not sure. I think sometimes the media, particularly the foreign policy media, tends to put too much stock in how Americans responded to that withdrawal, in the sense that they argue it will favor Trump or will change how people vote. So I wonder how, a couple of years after that withdrawal, and given what Trump has been doing with Gold Star families around that campaign, how you think, if at all, this would influence the outcome in November and American conduct kind of going forward as well.
Yeah, look, I mean, the president that ordered or invited or encouraged his supporters to ransack the Capitol isn't going to lose many votes in his base for having an altercation at Arlington Cemetery. I think that's a point to make. And I think what that row actually ended up doing was probably amplifying the voices of the families, the Abbeygate families, the families who lost their loved ones in that kind of chaos at Kabul airport in the withdrawal 3 years ago. And I thought at the time this could end up being a significant plus for Trump. And I didn't think Kamala Harris dealt with that question particularly well, because she didn't pay homage to the people who died. I don't think, did she? But she did double down on the withdrawal. She said it was, it was the correct thing to do. And I mean, the polling obviously suggests that was the correct thing to do. Although at the time, obviously, it was when the Biden honeymoon came to an end, wasn't it? And I think ever since the withdrawal from Afghanistan, his sort of approval ratings have been below water, and that was a kind of key moment of his presidency when things started to go awry. But yeah, I mean, the broader point about anything that we've talked about today is that just a small shift of votes in a very small number of states could determine the outcome of this election. I mean, it's going to be that finely balanced. I mean, you just look at Pennsylvania. I think for the last 2 cycles, Pennsylvania has been decided by 1%. So it's going to be a photo finish in Pennsylvania. I'm pretty sure it's going to be a photo finish in a lot of those other battleground states as well. So anything that kind of shifts a few votes here and there is going to be significant. And even though Afghanistan has sort of become sort of relegated in many ways, and it's in the back of the mind, and Ukraine seems more pressing, the Middle East seems more pressing, China seems more pressing, the lingering memory of that still could have an impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point about the razor thin margins that we're talking about is so critical, Nick, and they are razor thin. They're moving around a little bit, but they're still, often within less than a percentage point or a tie, even in some states. And we've actually got a question here from Patricia that has been upvoted many times, asking, I think in that context, in the context of the razor thin margins that we're talking about, if Harris wins, how do you anticipate Trump and his supporters will react?
Yeah, look, I think these are worrying sort of moments. I mean, elections now are becoming potential flashpoints, aren't they? Although, thankfully the midterms did pass without too many disputes. I think Carrie Lake in Arizona tried to dispute the outcome, and that really didn't go anywhere. And I think that was a positive. And there was that kind of political violence that was directed against Nancy Pelosi, wasn't it? But it was her husband who ended up being attacked when that guy tried to get into their home in San Francisco. So there was a small sort of political violence, but not on the scale that maybe you would have feared post January the 6th. Yeah, but that is a worry, isn't it? You could And already, you know, as we know, a lot of electoral officials have expressed deep concerns about their personal safety. One of the reasons why a lot of sort of moderate Republicans have been retiring is because they fear for their family's safety. You know, especially these people who voted for Trump's impeachment after January the 6th. I think all of them are no longer in Congress, either because they decided themselves to be stepped down or they got primaried, like Liz Cheney. So, yeah, that is a real concern for me. I mean, yeah, I mean, you know, you worry about crowds amassing at counting stations where recounts are going on. You worry about threats to electoral officials and electoral boards. Yeah, this could be a very difficult situation. The one thing I think that maybe is different, or that it's a significant difference than last time around, Trump won't have the power of the presidency. Joe Biden will. And I know a lot of this stuff obviously happens at the state level, and a lot of responsibility will lie with, you know, state officials. But the last time around, most of them were honorable. You know, when Trump tried to get that Republican state attorney general in Georgia to conjure up, what, 1,300 votes, he didn't. He refused. And the system just about held. So you'd hope that would happen again. But yeah, no, there's a potential for a flashpoint. There's no question.
Yeah. And speaking of the system, we've spoken a lot, Nick, about the way that system is set up, in that it could come down, and likely will come down, to a couple of those critical swing states. I've got a question here from Susan that's been upvoted quite a few times, because I think many Australians find this whole system kind of mystifying. So it's not a test, but Susan asks if you could explain why the Electoral College was even introduced, and why it does seem now so kind of actively anti-democratic.
Yeah, well, the founding fathers didn't like the idea of mass democracy. I mean, we the people was this phrase, and it sounded like it's a great statement of participatory intent, didn't it? But it wasn't. It was a phrase that in modern parlance would mean the body politic. And the founding fathers always believed that that body politic should be restrained by a very intricately designed straitjacket. And the design included mechanisms like the Electoral College. The Electoral College originally was a kind of compromise to the South that feared being overwhelmed by the North in presidential elections. It would give them power to thwart the will of the majority. The Senate was set up in a similar way. Even then, there were big discrepancies between the population sizes of the states, and yet every state got 2 senators. And that's created the anomalies of today. So the system was designed to have these counter-majoritarian mechanisms in place. And most of the time, it has to be said, you know, the person who's won the vote nationally has tended to win the Electoral College as well. I mean, 2000 was a bit of a wake-up call, wasn't it? So in so many ways, we not only learned about the vagaries of the Electoral College for the first time since 1888, we learned about the vagaries of an electoral system where a Democratic official in Florida could design a ballot that was so confusing to elderly Jewish voters that they ended up voting for an anti-Semitic candidate like Pat Buchanan. We also realized that the Supreme Court ultimately could actually intervene in an election to actually decide the outcome. I think that was sort of in some ways America entered into a new period of democratic recession. But I think the point is, and the point that I make very strongly in the book, The Forever War, America's Unending Conflict in itself, is that American democracy is in a sickly state now because it was never in robust health at the beginning. It was only in 1965. People forget this. Only in 1965, as recently as that the Voting Rights Act was passed, this landmark piece of legislation, which finally brought about universal suffrage in America. And what happened immediately afterwards? The attacks on Voting Rights Act began anew. And one of the reasons why American democracy isn't in great shape is that throughout its history, it's never been in great shape.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and such an important point. And it's something that, you know, Trump certainly didn't create. He's weaponized very effectively, but, you know, he didn't create it. He's kind of riding on the coattails of history.
I mean, there's an amazing stat, Emma, which, sorry, just to butt in there. There's an amazing stat. The last time that a Republican president actually won the presidency for the first time by winning the nationwide vote was 1988. Isn't that amazing? George W. Bush won the national vote in 2004 against John Kerry, but when he entered the White House, of course, Al Gore had got more votes than him. So yeah, and Trump, of course, got 3 million less than Hillary Clinton. So you actually have to go back to George Herbert Walker Bush in 1988 for a president who entered the White House for the first time, having won the popular vote.
Yeah, extraordinary, isn't it? And if Trump does win, I think there's no question, as we were discussing before, that he won't have won the popular vote. If polling is anything to go by, it's fairly clear that he won't have won the popular vote. We've got a follow-up question, I suppose, from Patricia around the if the system does work in Trump's favor, what do you think will be the first things that he does? What will be the first policies that he might introduce?
Well, he said that he'll be a dictator on day one. That's kind of alarming, isn't it?
Mildly, yep.
I think you wonder to what extent Project 2025 will become the reality. I think he will try and sort of gut the federal government of people who have stood in his way, and I think that will be a crucial difference between Trump 2.0 and the first time round. There aren't going to be the grown-ups in the room who try and restrain him. There aren't going to be the grown-ups who are the moderating influences. There aren't going to be the grown-ups who refuse to carry out his orders in some instances and hoped he'd just forget about them, which was what was happening in his first administration. So yeah, I do think there'd be it would be a very different administration. He knows his way around Washington now. He knows the system relies on norms as well as laws. He's got a better sense of his presidential powers, which were, not particularly well defined, it has to be said, by the founding fathers, partly because they knew George Washington was going to be the president and they thought he would be a kind of one-man check and balance himself. And he was, to be honest. He was pretty circumspect with how he carried out his presidential powers, knowing he would be setting this precedent. But there are gaps in the Constitution that Trump can drive through and exploit. And what would happen on day one? Do you know what? I reckon there'd probably be an argument about the crowd size of his inauguration.
Unfortunately, I think you're right. I think we've got time for probably one last question, which I'm going to use my chair's prerogative and ask myself. That kind of raises for me one of the almost kind of unaddressed issues that sits under this campaign, which is about the nature of the system that you've been talking about and the way that it appears to be kind of stuck in this deep hole involving a dysfunctional Congress and a politicized Supreme Court, which of course has always been political, but is kind of extremely politicized at the moment. In a lot of particularly Harris's campaigning and campaign promises, you can hear hints of that. When she in particular is talking about abortion, for example, she will kind of end her stump speech about abortion by saying she will sign the legislation that codifies abortion rights the minute it hits her desk. But of course, it has to hit her desk first, doesn't it? Which would require her to have won, or the Democrats to have won Congress, so to have won the House of Representatives, and not just the Senate, but a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. And that's, it doesn't seem likely that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Can you see any way through that for American politics?
I think one of the problems with America right now, it's got a constitution that it can't really live with because it creates so much gridlock. As you say, you've got this ridiculously politicized Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, by the way, was never meant to be supreme. That was never the intention of the founding fathers. They really saw the judiciary as way back in terms of the distribution of power between the president, the Congress, and the judiciary. It was really going to be a kind of non-player, but it's become so central. And this constitutional referee, partly because there is so much gridlock now on Capitol Hill, and often this gridlock between the president and Capitol Hill, and often this dispute over how much executive power the president's got. So you've got this kind of gridlock system that's unworkable. But Emma, if you got rid of that system as well, you would be opening the possibility, I think, to, the possibility of another civil war. And I say that because, the Democrats have won the popular vote in the last 7 out of the 8 presidential elections. So imagine a scenario where the Democrats have basically had a lock on the White House for much of the past sort of 20 years. And then imagine a scenario where the Senate is elected on a proportional basis. So California, New York dominate states like North Dakota and South Dakota, which is, I'm very strongly in favor for in many ways. But, then those rural states would be bossed by the urban states. You'd have the gun control would be very different, abortion would be very different. You'd have a situation where the ingredients really would be there for a kind of nationwide conflagration, I think. So you've got this kind of problem at the moment, and it's the problem I talk about in the book. America can't escape its past at the moment, and it's partly because so much of its history is unresolved, and it's partly because it's got this constitution that it needs to change, but it can't really afford to change. And so you're stuck. And the unending conflict keeps on playing out.
It does, and we will continue to watch on, I think, with some awe and some horror from here in Australia.
Well, look, everything I always say about America, I preface with a great love of the country. I mean, I'm not a kind of one of the European America bashers, quite the opposite. I love the place. I write out of a sense of pain and agony at times, and it's sad to see the country in such a divided state, but that's been the default setting from the beginning. America's always been divided. What we're seeing now is nothing new, really.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The past is not past. I am afraid, though, we'll have to, for the moment at least, wrap it up there. So please, I can see lots of little applause emojis coming through. Join me in thanking Nick Bryant so much for joining us and being so generous with your time. Nick, we appreciate it so much. And thank you too to our audience of 450 people at one stage for coming along and for your great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. There were an awful lot of them. A reminder that Nick's book that he has mentioned, and I can see people mentioning in the chat as well, is called The Forever War, America's Unending War with Itself. And it is a must read. It's available everywhere you can get good books. You can also go to our website to find out more about our upcoming events. And don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube so you can watch the recording of this and our other events. And also to our podcasts, After America, which focuses, of course, on American politics and which Nick has joined before, but also Follow the Money and Dollars and Cents. Thank you again so much, Nick. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. We'll see you next time.
Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.